Today, on a special edition of Brian Ross Investigates, Unmasking the Truth, President Trump makes a point of not wearing a mask at the White House and calls out those who do, reporters and his Democratic rival.
Can you take it off because I cannot hear you?
I'll just speak louder, sir.
Oh, okay, good. You want to be politically correct.
He's a fool, an absolute fool.
We'll talk with the professor who studied how masks were used to such good effect in the last great pandemic in 1918 and his fears of what may be in store for us now.
I fear there will be a second spike of cases, and there may not be the will to implement these, rather strict closure orders.
Plus, this week's winners.
I never saw a White House press secretary act like that.
And losers in the media.
This is why he won't wear a mask. He doesn't want to look funny.
See if you agree with the editor-in-chief of Mediaite. And your questions about COVID-19 and the law. Your job, your home, your right.
We really need the funds.
Please tell me where to turn.
From the Law&Crime Network, this is a special COVID-19 edition of Brian Ross Investigates. Thank you for joining us, and welcome to our viewers on YouTube Live and Facebook Live. I'm Brian Ross, joined today by my colleague at the Law&Crime Network, Rhonda Schwartz. And Rhonda, this week marked a sad and grim milestone for this country: 100,000 Americans dead from the COVID-19 pandemic. Certainly no cause for celebration, but also not something that should be ignored.
It's a horrible milestone and hard to even say it out loud. President Trump marked this horrific event on Twitter today. One of many tweets he sent is how he sent his condolences to the nation. But even so, he still refuses to wear a mask in public, which public health officials have basically told everyone to do to prevent more deaths.
That's right. He seems to be undercutting the advice from his own medical team. In fact, he's been making fun and poking fun at people who do wear masks as if somehow it's not manly. Here's what happened the other day at the White House.
No, Biden can wear a mask, but he was standing outside with his wife, perfect conditions, perfect weather. They're inside, they don't wear masks, and so I thought it was very unusual that he had one on, but I thought that was fine. I wasn't criticizing him at all. Why would I ever do a thing like that? And your second question was? I couldn't hear you. Can you take it off because I cannot hear you?
I'll just speak louder, sir.
Oh, okay, good. You want to be politically correct. Go ahead.
No, sir, I just want to wear the mask.
Go ahead.
And then Vice President Biden fired right back at the president.
He's a fool, an absolute fool to talk that way. I mean, every leading doc in the world is saying we should wear a mask when you're in a crowd. Presidents are supposed to lead, not engage in folly and be falsely masculine.
Of course, in the history of pandemics, masks have proven to be very effective. And to know more about that, I talked earlier this week with J. Alexander Navarro, who's a professor at the University of Michigan in the History and Medicine Department. And he has done a special report for the CDC and the Department of Defense of what happened more than 100 years ago in the 1918 influenza pandemic. Dr. Navarro, thank you so much for joining us. If we told our viewers that New York did pretty well in the pandemic, a lot better than many other cities, they wouldn't know what we're talking about. But there would be some truth, right, about 1918.
There'd be some truth. New York did fairly well, considering that it did not implement a wide range of these non-pharmaceutical interventions. They pretty much relied on a very stringent isolation and quarantine regimen, where they tried to identify cases of influenza as quickly as possible and remove them from circulation.
And we see the pictures you've gathered from 1918. It's a part of history that I never was taught in school, the influenza epidemic and the widespread use of masks.
Yeah, so masks were recommended in a lot of places. A lot of people across the country did use them, and they were mandated in certain cities. Denver, for example, San Francisco was a big example. Oakland, Seattle, these are communities that mandated the use of face masks. And in most of those cities, when it was mandated, there was quite a lot of pushback. And in San Francisco, in fact, there was so much pushback that a group of protesters formed what they called the Anti-Mask League. And there were at least 2,000 members. We don't have a roster of who was involved in this, but we know that in 1919, as the third wave of the epidemic rolled on, at least 2,000 people gathered for a meeting to hear, sort of protests about why these masks, the mandatory mask ordinance was unconstitutional, and why masks from a public health standpoint didn't work. And they were definitely much hated by a large portion of the San Francisco population.
So we see playing out again now in 2020 with President Trump noticeably not wearing a mask, and his potential Democratic rival, former Vice President Biden, making a point of wearing a mask and criticizing President Trump for criticizing him for wearing a mask. What do you make of what lessons should have been learned, what lessons we're going to learn today?
Well, the mask thing is interesting. If you take San Francisco, for example, the first time that San Francisco rolled out this mask ordinance was in the fall, along with some closures of places of public amusement. And there was a definite push both at the state level, which recommended the use of masks, and definitely at the local level by groups like the Red Cross, for example, and physicians who wanted this. There was a push to tie wearing of masks to patriotism. And of course, this is the time of World War I. So the idea was that you can enjoin people to do what they can on the home front. They can't necessarily fight in the war, but if our boys are overseas fighting in the war, the least you can do here is to protect society here by wearing a mask. And there were phrases like "don't be a mask slacker," for example, because there were people who refused to wear them in public, or people who had them on but maybe pulled them down to smoke a cigar or get a breath of fresh air. So there was definitely that political component to it. The fear today, of course, is that we know that masks are fairly effective. They're definitely more effective today than they were back in 1918. And there are recent studies that I just read one recently that based on some modeling that says if we can get 80% compliance of mask wearing while people are in public, we might be able to reduce COVID cases by maybe just 1/12 of the amount that we have now. So that's a pretty drastic reduction. Of course, getting compliance is difficult. 80% doesn't seem too high, but I do see lots of evidence of people circulating out in public, thinking that maybe because they're outdoors, they're safe. So going to boardwalks and beaches, for example, and not wearing masks. And so I think there are lots of lessons to draw from 1918 in terms of how society responded.
And what lesson can we draw from more than 100 years ago about the expected second or third wave of this pandemic?
So it's a little bit difficult, of course, because influenza and COVID are caused by two different viruses. So we can't say for sure that there will be another wave. It seems likely, and the epidemiologists and public health experts seem to be unanimous in their feeling that there most likely will be another wave in the fall. What I can say from the historical perspective is that when looking at 1918, when these closure orders were removed, and this was generally in around Armistice Day in a lot of cities, sometimes a little bit earlier in the East Coast and maybe a little bit later in the West Coast. A lot of cities, about half of the cities we studied, saw a second spike of cases as people started to circulate and mingle again. And in just two examples, San Antonio and Grand Rapids, Michigan, were the only two cities that we studied where those communities were able to re-implement the same level of closure orders a second time. In every other community that faced another spike of cases, there wasn't the political will or the economic will to implement another round of closure orders. And these closure orders in 1918 were not as sweeping as they are today. And so I think the lesson is, and my fear is, that once you remove these closure orders and these non-pharmaceutical interventions, and people are clamoring to get back to life as normal, whatever the epidemic is going to do, it's going to continue to do. You still have a population of people who are susceptible to it. And it's going to prove, I think, today, as it did in 1918, incredibly difficult to sort of put that toothpaste back in the tube, if you will, to implement another round of closure orders if it becomes necessary. And if people don't follow the social distancing guidelines, the recommendation to wear a mask, for example, they gather in large groups, regardless if it's indoors or outdoors, I fear there will be a second spike of cases, and there may not be the will to implement these, rather strict closure orders. I understand that people don't like them, but they're designed to sort of get us back to a place where we can more carefully manage the epidemic. And if we don't stay at that level where we can carefully manage it, I think we're in for a rough ride.
Well, Dr. Navarro, some important lessons to be learned, as always, from the past. We can learn from history. Thank you so much for all your research, and thanks for being with us here today.
Thank you, and you're welcome.
Coming up, the race for a COVID-19 vaccine and your questions about COVID-19 and the law. Should people who ignore the social distancing rules be treated like criminals? You're watching the Law and Crime Trial Network. Continuing now with your questions about COVID-19 and the law. And I'm joined by Bruce Barket of the firm Barket Epstein and by Aida Leisenring of the same firm. And Bruce, let me start with you. There is some concern, lots of questions about whether people who ignore these social distancing rules and mask rules, should they be treated like criminals?
Good afternoon. Thanks for having us. Absolutely not. The idea that somebody would be incarcerated or punished as a criminal for not following guidelines issued by a governor troubles and should trouble us all. These are guidelines that are being issued daily. They change daily. Forgive me for calling this science, but the science behind some of these orders changes daily also. You may recall that initially we were told, don't wear masks, they'll do no good. You can get COVID-19 from surfaces. Now we're being told the exact opposite by the same people who are telling us what we should have done in the first instance. These are guidelines. People should follow them if they believe them to be correct, but they're not criminal laws. They weren't passed by the legislature. And even if they were, I think they'd be struck down by the courts.
Well, Aida, let me ask you this. There have been people who have been placed under arrest, fines issued. What's going to happen when those cases end up in court, Aida?
Well, I imagine all the good defense attorneys of each state are going to fight them vigorously. As Bruce mentioned, these are not actual laws that have been legislated and enacted. Furthermore, there's some confusion as to what the laws actually are. Now, a lot of people don't know this, but in New York, one of the penal law violations is you're not permitted to wear a mask unless it has exceptions. It's a masquerade party. So at some point you were told, or actually it's current law now, that you shouldn't wear a mask. Now this pandemic happens, the governor tells you that you have to wear one if you can't socially distance within 6 feet. And the order is technically inconsistent with the law that's actually on the books.
Right. And as Bruce said early on, we were told masks didn't do that much good. Don't worry about it. Now we're told the exact opposite. Bruce, a question for you from Rhonda Schwartz. Rhonda?
Bruce, you're known for your white-collar criminal defense work. And what is happening with your clients with the courts closed? What are the risks and issues facing the folks who have cases pending in the criminal justice system?
Well, it really is a tale of two cities. Individuals who are out on bail and who are otherwise functioning are perfectly happy to have the courts stay closed forever, because at the end of the day for them is a trial and the, and the risk of a conviction. For those of our clients who are in jail, who are incarcerated, this is torture. They are literally locked in their cells 23 hours a day, no visits at all, no legal visits, no social visits, no family members, very little time to speak to their family, and they're simply languishing there. So for clients facing criminal charges, it really depends on whether or not you were fortunate enough, rich enough to post bail.
Absolutely. And we've seen again and again in prisons, nursing homes, and Indian reservations, terrible death tolls from the pandemic. Now, Aida, let me ask you this. For people who are locked up and get this disease and don't do well, is there a legal recourse for them against the wardens, against the prison systems?
You would have to look at the individual facts and also whether there was any litigation and warning about pre-existing conditions. A lot of inmates do have hypertension, do have heart disease, and are at risk of a fatal COVID infection. Now, each prison and each pretrial detention facility works differently and has their own set of rules. I've spoken to clients that for weeks were not given masks, were not given gloves, were permitted to go into a common room with 12 other individuals. They said the cleaning was no more than it had been in the past. In other facilities, there is no way to socially isolate each inmate from one another, and they're actually in dormitories. There have been instances where many inmates have actually gotten COVID and were not tested, or the public wasn't told about it. So I do foresee many lawsuits coming forward.
And Bruce, I've been talking with a number of people who are still behind bars. They were initially promised their sentences would be reduced. They'd be able to go home because of the COVID-19. And now the rules have changed. What are you finding in terms of trying to get people out of prison because of the health risk?
Well, initially it was actually somewhat easier. As the restrictions are being reduced across the board, the sense that prisoners are at a greater risk is also being reduced. So judges are less and less likely to grant release to people now than they were initially, when the fear factor, if you will, was significantly higher. And that's troubling because the COVID threat in prison is just as severe now as it was a month ago. It hasn't changed, and in some ways it's worsened because you have this closed-in, locked environment with virus traveling around in there. So it's been difficult for individuals that are still incarcerated.
And let me ask you, in addition to people being arrested for not following social distancing guidelines, there have been other criminal cases that have come because of the quarantine. One, fraud with some of the applications for the federal grant money, and also issues of domestic abuse. What do you see about that, and how is that being handled?
Well, the issues with domestic violence have to be taken seriously on all directions. And here's a situation. You have a couple, there's an increase in drinking across many homes. People just get on each other's nerves. So there may be a dispute that does not rise to the level that necessitates incarceration or an order of protection. But in almost every case where there's a domestic incident, most judges are going to issue orders of protection. That means that now either the husband or the wife can't go home. It also means that they're then forced to go into another home, thereby potentially infecting, say, their elderly parents and so forth. So it is troubling, and it is very serious. At the same time, we're seeing a huge decrease in DWIs and in residential burglaries. So there's upsides and downsides to how the pandemic is affecting criminal cases.
Right. And Bruce, we've heard from a number of small business owners who are concerned they may be walking themselves into legal troubles because of the way they got money from the government for grants and whether they used it properly or not. What's your best advice? Might they really face criminal prosecution?
Well, no, the criminal prosecution wouldn't be a consequence of using the money improperly as long as you were truthful in filling out the application. So there's two parts to the process. The first part is you're applying for the money and you made representations about costs of employees, rent, interest on lines of credit.
Looks like we may have lost Bruce there. Aida, I'm going to ask you to pick it up there while we get Bruce's connection reestablished. That issue, Aida, if you can hear me, what happens to people that have applied for some of the federal grant money and the figures weren't quite right?
Well, it goes to every criminal, every crime has to have an element of a mens rea, most every crime. What that means is that the individual actually intended to defraud. Now, there's a lot of confusion out there as to who's eligible and who isn't eligible. If it's a matter of bad advice or just an accident and genuine, the person didn't know or the business didn't know, then that's not going to be criminalized. But if there's sufficient evidence of an intent to defraud, that would be something that's eligible to for an arrest.
And these are difficult times. And going back for a moment with your question about domestic violence, isn't it usually the procedure for police? They almost are mandated to make an arrest if they respond to a domestic violence report?
Yes. Whenever anybody files a complaint and the police show up at your door, even if that individual says, I wasn't serious, I was just angry, nothing actually happened, nobody's really hurt. If the allegation was one of violence, then in almost every case, the police guidelines are mandatory arrest and then figure it out later. They do actually have discretion. And I think during the pandemic, the police ought to exercise their discretion, especially given the fact that tensions are on the rise and people are required to stay home, and many people don't have other places to go without reinfecting other individuals. That said, you do have to take true instances of domestic violence seriously and protect the victims.
You know, we're now seeing around the country some states, some courts beginning to reopen, some clerks' offices reopen for filing, but there's going to be a huge backlog, isn't there, once the courts do reopen?
It is going to be a tremendous backlog, particularly with grand jury indictments. A lot of individuals have been either languishing in jail waiting to be indicted, and instead they're now permitting felony examinations. And a lot of people are outside knowing that an indictment is imminent, but grand juries just haven't convened. So prosecutors are going to be extremely busy. Defense attorneys are going to be extremely busy. There's going to be a huge backlog. And as a result of that, we may expect to see a higher instance of plea negotiations and hopefully more favorable offers for people that are actually deserving.
And what happens to the speedy trial rule?
Well, the speedy trial rule is suspended by law, even though you have a constitutional right to a speedy trial. But by state law, it tends to be suspended when there's an extraordinary or an emergency situation. Obviously, courts have been granting the applications to prosecutors that 3030 be suspended as a result of the pandemic. But the problem with that is if this is indefinite and you don't find a vaccine for another year and a half, or let's just say 6 months to 8 months, you have individuals that are incarcerated. They're not able to visit with family members. They're not able to use the phones as much. They're not able to get rec time. It is torture. It is no longer pretrial confinement. It can be cruel and excessive. But at the same time, you can't force 12 to 16 citizens to sit in a small box together for weeks.
Truly an issue. Well, Aida, Leisenring, thank you so much. And thank your partners, Bruce Arquette. Appreciate both of you coming on today very much. Very helpful to talk to you.
Thank you for having us. Take care.
Yeah, great. Coming up, the race for a vaccine and the media winners and losers. What did Matt Lauer do? You're watching the Law&Crime Trial Network.
When the case first broke, Shanann and Cece and Bella were simply missing.
Like, I have no inclination to where they're at right now.
Something in your gut was telling you that he had something to do with it.
Chris Watts thought that he could go to the police department, knowing the fact that he killed his family.
Why should I believe you? Because I'm a very trustworthy person.
Breeze through a polygraph test.
You intend to answer all of the questions truthfully?
Yes.
Continuing now with the race for a vaccine, everything seems to hinge on finding some kind of a way to prevent COVID-19 from taking over our lives completely. To find more about what's going to happen, how soon it might happen, I talked earlier today with Dr. William Schaffner, who's professor of preventive medicine at Vanderbilt University in Tennessee. Dr. Schaffner, thank you so much for joining us today. The whole world is waiting for any news about a vaccine. What's the latest from your point of view, and what's your hope about this?
Well, of course, we're all hoping, Brian, for a vaccine absolutely as soon as possible. But that hope is cautioned because we all know vaccine development usually takes a fair amount of time and is often not a straight line. But just the other day, Dr. Anthony Fauci was a little more optimistic, and he thought maybe at least one vaccine would be licensed by sometime this winter. Well, that's very encouraging. I hope that that's the case. I'm not going to put my dollar on that horse just yet, but if it comes, we'll be ready for it. We certainly would like to get it out here so we can start distributing it. And, you know, we would distribute it first, I think, to healthcare providers and to first responders, and then in a phased fashion, as more and more vaccine becomes available, it would be distributed more widely to the general population.
As you know, there are dozens and dozens of candidates under development now. Is there one you think has the most promise?
Well, at the moment, the one that seems to be leading the pack is one that's being developed by a group in Oxford, England. It is using a new technology. We call it an mRNA vaccine. There's no quite such vaccine that's been licensed yet, although a lot of scientific work has gone into it over the years. They're entering into clinical trials, large trials, to make sure that it's safe and also, of course, effective. And if so, how effective? How many doses would be required? It might actually require 2 doses. That would require us to double the amount of vaccine that we produce and to reach everyone twice with a needle and syringe. That would make it even more challenging. But so far, so good.
All right. Dr. Schaffner, a question for you from Rhonda Schwartz. Rhonda?
Dr. Schaffner, last month you said that the virus was getting out ahead of us. How do we get back out ahead of it? What's the current situation? What's your outlook now?
Well, at the moment, I think we may be tied with the virus. We're keeping up with it. In most parts of the country, we're remaining stable. That is, everybody who gets infected is infecting only one other person rather than 2 or 3, which means we're sort of in a plateau. We're going to see bursts of transmission here and there. And frankly, I was a little worried over the Memorial Day weekend. I saw an awful lot of people being awfully cavalier, being very close to each other and not wearing masks. If that happens, the virus will then get a jump on us again. But at the moment, we're hanging tight. And of course, the next big surge that I anticipate will come in the late fall and early winter, where, along with influenza, I think both of those viruses are going to increase again, and we'll be dealing with a dual respiratory winter virus season.
Good grief. Dr. Schaffner, you were one of the first to come on our program here on Law and Crime and talk about this issue. Has it played out the way you thought it would?
Both yes and no. This is a highly communicable virus. What I've frankly been surprised at is that we haven't had a more coordinated, nationally directed response. There's been an awful lot of ad hocing, state by state and city by city. That's been necessitated. In the past, when we've had large pandemic threats or infectious disease threats, Zika virus, Ebola, the 2009 H1N1 influenza, the CDC, the public health leadership, has taken the lead and has guided the states, and the states have fallen into line and generally all been very coherent in their response. It's been much more disjointed this year, and the CDC, this premier public health institution, which I love, has been kind of sidelined, and that's unfortunate, I think.
And do you think the fact that the CDC was sidelined by the Trump administration, has that cost lives?
Well, I think our response hasn't been nearly as coordinated, as forthright, and as bold as it could have been. And so, obviously, many more people have gotten sick, and as a consequence, some people have died. Yes.
And you're back in your office now. You're continuing to work. What's next, do you think?
Well, what's next is developing new therapies, and we're all waiting for the many trials of different therapeutic agents, different drugs, to mature and get us the data, because we need better treatments. Fortunately, we're starting to test, certainly in my state and others, more extensively. So we're doing a better job in finding cases, and our health department has been augmented with case finders, people who can trace the contacts of cases, and that's aiding our public health response. So we're hanging in there. I think we're doing a better job of keeping up with the virus, but we can't let our guard down. There are people who would like to go back to the old normal. We have to go forward to a new normal. Wearing masks will become routine. The famous or infamous 6-foot rule will still be in place. A lot of good hand hygiene. And people who are older, people who have underlying chronic illnesses, they should hold back, particularly from group activities, religious services, concerts, athletic events, because those kind of grouped activities are exactly the place that the COVID virus likes to be transmitted. It remains a very contagious virus, and it will be with us.
Dr. William Schaffner, thank you so much. That's tough medicine, but it's something everyone should hear.
Thank you, Brian.
Coming up, this week's winners and losers in the media. See if you agree with the editor-in-chief of Mediaite. You're watching the Law and Crime Trial Network.
When the case first broke, Shanann and Cece and Bella were simply missing.
Like, I have no inclination to where they're at right now.
Something in your gut was telling you that he had something to do with it.
Chris Watts thought that he could go to the police department, knowing the fact that he killed his family.
Why should I believe you? Because I'm a very trustworthy person.
Breeze through a polygraph test.
You intend to answer all of the questions truthfully.
Yes.
And we wrap up our program this week with one of our favorites, the winners and losers in the media. We're joined by Aida McLaughlin, who's the editor-in-chief of Mediaite, part of the Dan Abrams media family, as is the Law and Crime Network. And Aida, it was quite a busy week in the media. You had lots of interesting choices to make.
We did, yeah. It's actually been a fairly surprising week in media happenings. You've got a lot of things roped in, from politics angles to tech angles to the debut of a new press secretary who joined a couple weeks ago. So it's a really interesting one. I'm excited to get into it.
Right, and you began with winners who, two reporters who went after the new press secretary. Let's look at those clips.
What specific provision of federal law allows the president to override a governor's
The president
decision?
will strongly encourage every governor to allow their churches to reopen. And boy, it's interesting to be in a room that desperately wants to seem to see these churches and houses of worship stay closed.
The president said that he has that.
Really, I object to that. I mean, I go to church. I'm dying to go back to church.
Donna, I spent 6 years in the White House briefing room covering Ronald Reagan. I have to say, I never, and in the years since too, I never saw a White House press secretary act like that.
I think her behavior is indefensible and grotesque.
So what do you make of that, Aiden? That was quite an attack on the new press secretary in her maiden voyage almost.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, let's first go back and look at what happened with Kayleigh McEnany in that press briefing. Basically, reporters were questioning the administration on whether it's wise to open up places of worship while the coronavirus pandemic is still spreading in the United States. It's still ongoing. We know that closed spaces, the virus spreads most easily. So there's a lot of questions as to whether or not it's wise to be opening up churches and other places of worship to allow people to come in and potentially spread the virus and create hotspots. Now, Kayleigh McEnany was getting questioned about that at the press briefing and responded by almost accusing reporters of being uninterested in having places of worship reopening, when they were just raising legitimate questions about whether or not that would be a dangerous idea or a good idea. Now, Chris Wallace and Jonah Goldberg here, who were both speaking on Fox News Sunday, raised some pretty good criticisms of Kayleigh McEnany, pointed out that, that this idea that reporters in the White House press corps are sort of have no interest in seeing places of worship reopen. It's sort of based on a stereotype that reporters are all sort of coastal elites and they don't understand the sort of religious America. And I think they did a really good job of criticizing Kayleigh McEnany, and they weren't alone. Jake Tapper also criticized her for those comments over on CNN. But it's always notable when the president's favorite network, Fox News, airs a harshly critical segment calling out the press secretary of this administration. And I think they were right to call her out. And so we made them winner that day.
Right, but at the same time, you give to Fox News, you take away. You went after Brit Hume. Let's listen to the clip from Brit Hume.
I think when he looks at that picture of Joe Biden, he thinks Biden looks ridiculous, and he kind of does, and he doesn't want to look that way. And in fact, the fact that he retweeted that tweet of mine, which I certainly didn't expect, suggests that he agrees with what I said. This is why he won't wear a mask. He doesn't want to look funny.
So Brit Hume defending the president there is sort of like didn't want to be unmanly, I guess, huh?
Yeah, that was his defense of a tweet that he put out over Memorial Day weekend, where he essentially mocked Joe Biden for wearing a mask on Memorial Day when he was visiting a cemetery. And, you know, the president has made a point of not wanting to wear a mask out in public because he clearly thinks that the appearance of it is unbecoming. Joe Biden has taken an opposite posture and has effectively worn the mask out in public as a sign that, you know, of following good health protocol. Now, what's so bizarre about this is that, you know, Joe Biden wearing the mask is following the Trump administration's guidelines on what to do in public. You know, the day before he wore the mask on Memorial Day, the Surgeon General, Jerome Adams, who works for the Trump administration, put out a video advising everyone to wear a mask on Memorial Day if they went out in public. So it's just sort of odd to see Brit Hume, who is a senior political analyst at Fox News, mocking Joe Biden for following the Trump administration's guidelines on wearing masks out in public, and then President Trump retweeting Brit Hume. So sure, you can argue that it's sort of unbecoming to wear masks. I'm not sure why you would. I don't think that Joe Biden looks particularly bad in a mask. I don't think anyone looks particularly bad in a mask, particularly when it's just a move to be safe during a pandemic that has taken 100,000 American lives. Brit Hume seems to think so. I think it's an odd argument to make. I don't think his defense of the tweet did anything to make me think that it was less of a bad idea. And again, I think it really needs to be stressed how bizarre it is that you have a president that is mocking Joe Biden for following his administration's own protocol on safety during the pandemic.
I'll say it's apparently the new normal. We're getting used to the outrageousness of the president, which continues. Another winner, though, you're going after Fox News here. Fox News, a victory. You call them a winner. Why was that?
Sure. Now, that was today we made Fox News the winner because, Brian, we've spoken about this before. There was a lawsuit that was launched by an activist group called Washlight. And it's a group out of Washington State. And they were suing Fox News. And their case against Fox News basically held that the network's downplaying of the coronavirus was in violation of consumer finance laws in the state, consumer protection laws in the state, excuse me. And basically their argument was that Fox News should not be allowed to have the same First Amendment protections that newspapers like the New York Times have. Now, they brought that lawsuit to a judge in Washington, and that judge on Wednesday dismissed the case. Now, that's a huge win for Fox News because it means that, you know, Fox News is not going to be sued over their coverage. But it also is a win for the press in general. You know, Fox News actually got a lot of support from entities that typically are harsh critics of the network. And I think this fundamentally boils down to, and the judge echoed this in dismissing this case, is that you can disagree with Fox News' coverage of the coronavirus pandemic all you want, but their coverage of it should not be sort of guided or chaperoned by a judge in Washington State determining what opinion is legal and what opinion is illegal. So I think the judge throwing this out is a good step for the First Amendment. It's good for press organizations, for press outlets everywhere, and it was good for Fox News.
Right. I suppose only Fox News would be surprised that other reporters and news organizations came to their defense. As you know, Aiden, we had you on earlier this week with the Deputy General Counsel, the top newsroom lawyer for the New York Times, who said, of course, David McCraw said that Fox News enjoyed the same protections as the New York Times when it came to the First Amendment. So that was a victory for Fox News and for the First Amendment. Let me ask you now, the next loser you chose, we're going to talk about Twitter and Jack Dorsey.
Yeah, so it's been a really, really rough week for Jack Dorsey, who's the CEO of Twitter. It actually keeps getting worse for him. Basically, the culmination of an almost years-long pressure campaign on behalf of critics of the president to get Jack Dorsey and Twitter to take action against President Donald Trump's tweets pretty much culminated at the beginning of the week when President Donald Trump has been pushing this absurd conspiracy theory that Joe Scarborough, who is the MSNBC host of Morning Joe, had something to do with the death of a congressional aide in his office when he was a congressman in Florida more than 2 decades ago. President Donald Trump has been pushing this conspiracy theory that Joe Scarborough somehow had something to do with that, and coming very close to accusing Joe Scarborough of murder in a series of tweets. Now, a lot of people have been calling on Twitter, particularly Mika Brzezinski, who is the wife now of Joe Scarborough, have been calling on Twitter to take action and to delete those tweets from President Donald Trump. Now, the widower of the young woman who died in Joe Scarborough's office is also calling on Twitter to delete those tweets. Now, Twitter resisted those calls. They did not take any action against those tweets from the president, but they did later that day when they were getting immense pressure this week to take action against the president's tweets. They added a note to one of his tweets about mail-in ballots that linked to a fact check that basically said that the president's comments about mail-in voting were inaccurate. And that drew harsh criticism from the president. I don't think it satisfied many of Twitter's critics that they were effectively taking this seriously enough. And now the president has said that today he's going to unveil an executive order targeting social media platforms for bias against conservatives, which is, should alarm conservatives everywhere that the president is talking about regulating social media platforms because, on First Amendment grounds. But now, Jack Dorsey, I don't think he's satisfied his critics who really think that President Donald Trump should be booted from Twitter altogether. He certainly has drawn the furious ire of the president, who's now calling for Twitter to be regulated. And the president even called in a tweet earlier this week to shut down Twitter. So he's sort of in an impossible position now. He can't boot President Donald Trump off the platform because the president is the president and has a huge following, and that would create gigantic problems for Twitter, no matter what you think of the president's tweets. So Jack Dorsey's in an impossible position now, and now he's attracted a furious criticism from the president, who's looking to wield executive power to punish Twitter for these moves.
You can see why he's a loser. He really couldn't win whatever he did. And it's a long time coming, this issue of, are they publishers or just sort of a bulletin board for others to put up their words?
Sure, yeah, and that's always been the problem with Twitter. It's do they say that they're a publisher and then they're allowed to make editorial decisions about what kind of content get published on their platform, or do they take the tack that now Mark Zuckerberg is saying Facebook takes, where they are simply refusing to determine what is true and what is false, and saying that we are just an open forum for people to post. Now, there's all sorts of problems with that when it comes to hate speech. Every social media platform needs guidelines that users have to adhere to. When you get into issues with facts, that becomes a real problem for social media platforms because, is Twitter going to basically farm out their fact checking to CNN, the Washington Post, to other reporters, which is what they did with this mail-in ballot tweet. It linked to a fact check from CNN. Do they do it in-house, which is going to take a remarkable amount of resources to fact check every single tweet that gets published on Twitter that gets flagged as having potential misinformation. It creates a debate in and of itself about which one of the president's tweets are inaccurate, and fact checking is just a really sort of a difficult part of journalists' jobs. For social media platforms to be taking on that responsibility is a really tough feat. So again, it's a really problematic position for Jack Dorsey to be in. I don't envy him.
Right, and now he's being attacked by Mark Zuckerberg at Facebook. He can't win. It's a tough one. I recall that lots of companies talked about buying Twitter. They didn't want to touch it. It's like a third rail. Aidan, thank you so much. A lot more to come this week, right?
Yeah. We've got we're waiting to see what happens with this executive order. I know Kayleigh McEnany just wrapped up a press briefing. I'm sure that there's a lot of news coming out of that. So yeah, we'll check back in for winner and loser tomorrow. I'm sure there'll be a lot more.
All right. Thank you, Aidan, and thanks to all of you for joining us, and thanks to those at the Law and Crime team that get us on the air and off the air.